So that was a great video that helped, in a funny way, reinforce the message that they were trying to get across. So yes, you get to see me again, and I'm going to introduce the next panel as soon as we watch a video on human factors and pilot controller communication. We're going to try to focus on just a couple of topics versus this wide open thing that we normally get into to kind of delve down into the climb and descend via, and if we have time, which I'm not sure we will, we'll get into emergencies. So if you would, roll the video, please.
Das hier ist mein Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät. Überlebensradar.
Mayday, Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
So that's it. Kind of how sometimes pilot-controller communications happen, so I think that was a good illustration of some of that. But first I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Jason Demalgaski from Human Factors and Fatigue Risk Manager for the ATO. David Bricker, NACA's Human Factors Representative on the National Safety Committee. John Drexler from ALPA, and he's the NACA liaison. Mike Schilz, also from ALPA, and works a lot on FOQA and ASIAS and ASAP, and we've known him for a long time, along with John, great partners in working on safety issues. Rick Loewen, our National RSAT representative from NACA, and Dennis Kelly, our National PBN representative from NACA. Like I said earlier, we're going to focus on the human factors side of climate descend via and all this, and emergencies if we get to it. But I kind of think that this somewhat of a hot topic might take up a lot of our time. As climate descend via was implemented, we started to see issues. Now we see issues with top altitudes, bottom altitudes, just the phraseology, whether or not the center should be assigning runway transitions on the stars. Assignment of an altitude when an aircraft is deviating for weather, off of a star. If an aircraft, if an aircraft has been vectored off a sitter star, informing the pilot where they can expect to resume the procedure. All of these have been issues, and they've been identified, and they're talked about all the time in work groups throughout the industry, and we want to kind of focus on those. So I'm going to first kick it over to Jason to talk a little bit about some of those human factors issues, and then we'll go to Dave to talk about some of the crew resource management issues that he's passionate about, and then we'll have somewhat of a discussion between the panelists about climate descend via, and then if we have time at the end after some questions from the audience, we'll move on to the next topic. So, Jason?
Thank you.
The green button.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Steve asked me to give a general high-level introduction to human factors communication issues. This is very generic. It's going to be very obvious to some of you what I'm talking about, but it just plants the seed for some of the issues which influence the way we actually communicate. So when is communication effective? Well, it's stating the obvious. It is when the message is received as it was intended. So when the message you transmitted to the pilot or the pilot transmitted to the controller leads to an action, which is what you both intended it to be at the start. One of the things that catches about communication is about we don't actually ever get formally taught how to communicate. If you look at the slide up here, it talks about this way in which we learn the order of skills we use to communicate: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. However, the ones we use the most are the ones we don't ever get taught how to do, and the ones we use the least are the ones we spend a lot of time in school learning. So we learn how to read and write. We never get taught how to listen and speak. As controllers and pilots, we learn standard phraseology, the kind of language that will help us to communicate. But funnily enough, we're often not very good at communicating. And I know I'm not the only person in this room who said something to their partner, and that is not what I meant, and then have to explain afterwards what I intended that communication to mean. So we always get it wrong when we communicate. A study by NASA looked at where some of these communication errors go wrong, and it found that incorrect communication is the most common issue in the ASRS databases, and also absence of communication. But the majority one is incorrect communication, often resulting from a non-use of standard phraseology. If you look at what pilots and controllers are actually doing in that communication loop, you see what's up here on the slide. We have controller issuing a clearance. They transmit that clearance. It gets received by the pilot, who hears it, who understands it, and then reads it back to the controller, and so on. But each one of those green lines is open to barriers to communication, where various things interact with what we're trying to do and break that communication down. So some of those barriers up there, for example, physical barriers, quality of the radio, quality of the headsets, the noise around us in the ops room where you're working, they can obviously limit the communication issues, but less obvious, things like attention. Actually, whether we're paying attention at the time, whether we're distracted in the ops room, whether the pilots themselves are distracted and working hard. At the various phases of flight, we think pilots may not have much to do, and we'll learn later what they're actually doing at those phases of flight, and vice versa. They may think the controller has time when the controller is actually working very hard and miss things. Perceptual biases, so we hear what we want to hear. We have an expectation. If I really want to hear climb to 280 as the pilot, I'm listening, hoping to hear the words 280. So I hear the heading 280, I may jump on that as what I wanted to hear. Workload, high workload times, assumptions, fatigue. If you drop by the fatigue stand, you'll learn more about fatigue. That's a big issue in terms of hearing what we want to hear again. Distractions, interruptions, and our personality traits. Now, of course, I have a different accent. I've got the British accent. There are many things I say too in communication where what I mean and what I should be saying can be somewhat different. And a few things to think about before I pass on to Dave. Dave will talk about short-term memory and some of the issues with that. But one of the things about our memories is we tend to forget what's in the middle of a clearance. So when we're issuing very long clearances to pilots, you'll hear the pilot often catches the start and the end of that message. It's what's in the middle that gets lost, and vice versa. When the pilot reads back something long to you as a controller, it's the middle part we often miss. Be aware that when we're communicating with people in our native languages, when we often let our guard down. As pilots listening to controllers in other countries, or as you listening to pilots from other countries, you pay a lot more attention because we believe there may be more chance of an error. We make more assumptions that people who speak English are going to actually make less errors, and that in itself can catch you out. Research has shown that when you read instructions too quickly to pilots, if it's a very quick readback, about 80% of the time there may be an error. When we slow down our speech rate, that error rate drops. But of course, then we don't get as much information out as the controller. So it's a balance between the two. It's important to understand what's going on in the flight deck. And I know that the pilots here will talk about that later on. That again, what they're doing at the times when we're doing our jobs. Beware of ambiguity in communication. We use lots of phrases like Roger, Wilco, copied, whereby we think we've actually clearly replied and we've understood the message, but again, not necessarily clear. And finally, we're not good at spotting human errors because the chances of the error leading to a negative consequence are fairly low, so therefore we have an assumption that it's going to work okay. Okay, Dave.
Hello, everybody. How many have heard of CRM, Crew Resource Management? How many have taken a formal course in CRM? Well, that's good. It's more than I expected. So CRM, Cockpit Resource Management on the pilot side, Crew Resource Management on our side. Eurocontrol calls it Team Resource Management. They have a really good air traffic course template that I'd like to see used. Obviously, pilot interaction is where CRM started. Pilot interaction between the FO and the captain. It's in a small system, very contained, but it's branched considerably. So for our perspective, it involves the controller, both the R and the D side, where the assistant, the frontline, TMU, the OM, other areas, other sectors, approach, towers, dispatch, flight service, airline management, and pretty much anybody else that you guys interact with on a normal day. It's a very complex system. Obviously, CRM for us, the way we communicate with the pilots in an asynchronous method, obviously via radios for the most part, although it's going to shift in a few years to datacom to some extent. So in order to mitigate your workload and the pilot's workload, it's important that you issue instructions that are clearly understood, not overly complex. The way to do that is one of the things, as Jason alluded to, is speech rate. Don't talk overly fast, although as we all know, when your workload is very high, we have a tendency to talk extremely quickly. The information given is important, and the amount of information is extremely important. So there was a study done in 2006 by CAMI, which is the research arm of the agency, on message complexity and how it relates to readback errors. So CAMI, using SME input, assigned a complexity value to every bit of phraseology that we issue, control instructions for the most part. So, for example, a climb and maintain 14000 was worth 6 points. Headings, instructions, speed instructions worth generally 4. So if you were to give a climb and maintain 14000, fly heading 260, reduce speed to 250, all in one transmission, Camius gave it a point score of 14 points. And based on that point score, the amount of readback errors by the pilots was 30 to 40%, and it climbs considerably after that. So it's extremely important that you keep your information simple, chunk when you can, talk slow when you can, although it's not always possible. And part of the reason for that is the way we process information within our short-term memory. So generally, we can remember 7 plus or minus 2 things at a time in our short-term memory. So anywhere between 5 and 9, differs by person, differs by your state of mind, fatigue levels, workload affects that as well. The other important thing to remember is that information not actively retained in short-term memory begins to decay within 30 seconds. So it's important that you get the information out, the pilots understand it, that way you don't have to go back and repeat yourself because it affects your workload and their workload.
Thanks, Jason and Dave. To kind of get into the topic now with climb and descend via, let's talk about a couple of the issues that have come up. And with that, I want to kick it over to John Drexler and to Dennis Kelly to talk a little bit from a pilot perspective. What are some of the biggest issues with those two procedures that you see? And then I'd like Dennis to jump in, and of course, Mike and Rick, feel free as well. But we'll go in that order to begin with.
From my work dealing with SISP analysis with regard to climb and descend via, some of the biggest issues we as flight crews have run into has been analysis of top altitude on some procedures, where you'll have a procedure that in the textual view will show, say, maintain 4,000. And then when you're looking at the plan view, it may show numerous transitions that will show 11,000. So it'll cause, if the pilots pick up on it in the first place and then don't go dialing, it says on their PDC to climb via the SID, they may roll 11,000 into their mode control panel instead of putting in the 4,000 that's actually the more restrictive altitude. So a lot of times that's an issue of understanding what's on the plate, and from a human factors point of view, both pilots agreeing on what that information is, and if they don't agree, then maybe contacting the controller to say, is this a 4,000 top altitude or an 11,000? So we get that cleared up. There have been instances where pilots have blown right through the 4,000 climbing up to 11 because of that misunderstanding. The other issue would be the big issue is the bottom altitude. A lot of times that's tied into issues of a runway assignment. So we like to get our briefings done as early as possible in that nice, stable cruise environment prior to the top of descent. So we'll go look at our ATIS and we'll see what the runway in use is, and then we'll take an educated guess on what runway we're going to get, and we'll select the procedure and the transition accordingly. So we'll dial in what we think a bottom altitude is, and then we'll go ahead and we'll put it in the computer, we'll have our brief it, and we'll start down, and lo and behold, that's not what we get. So again, human factors, what happened? So here we are in a descent, trying to make altitude and speed restrictions on these arrivals, and now we have to go back in the box, reselect the procedure, reselect the appropriate runway, and then go and clean it up and verify it between both pilots, all while we're still handling ATC transmissions, making sure, monitoring the aircraft to make sure we're not missing anything on the way down. So there's a lot going on there. You want to throw in weather deviations or off-route type things that may occur as well. It can be quite a handful. As off-route's another issue, since I mentioned it, let me know if I'm getting too far ahead of here. But we can come back to it, just kind of overview. Off route, we may be involved in a descent procedure, and due to whatever the circumstances, whether we're catching up to the traffic in front of us, or they put in a new in-trail restriction, or there's a runway change involved, they may need to vector us off. So they'll say fly heading such and such, maintain such and such altitude. We got to go up, take that bottom altitude off our mode control panel, put in that new hard altitude, fly around, then you say, okay, fly such and such heading, rejoin the arrival. So now we need to also know that when we rejoin that arrival, is it now to also descend via, put that bottom altitude back in? At what point are we going to pick up that arrival, at what altitude? We've had flight crews who have said, well, that's a descend via. We get there, we're going to start down. Well, in fact, the controller actually wanted you just to fly the lateral and maintain your last assigned altitude. So there's another bottom issue gotcha on that respect. And one other issue I would talk about would be maybe sometimes these procedures are designed in such a way that one size doesn't fit all. What might work for a 737 may not, in fact, work for an ERJ. And what might work in certain wind conditions won't work when you have a 100-knot tailwind. It may, in fact, exceed the aircraft's ability to meet the descent ratios that are required to hit all these points. So there's a plethora of issues involved with climb and descend via, and then there's also the phraseology issues, but I've talked enough.
Yes, just a little bit, but you're okay. Dennis?
Okay, well, I got 32 years as an air traffic controller. I have a great memory, but it's pretty short. So all the topics he talked about, I don't remember all of them, but I'll start with the climb via. He's right. Figuring out the top altitude is pretty difficult because the charts, they could have it in 3 different spots. They could have it on the graphic. They could have it in a note on the side. They could have it in a narrative. However, these procedures haven't changed. That's been that way for a long time. What has changed is the phraseology. So as a result of changing the phraseology, what we can give them in the clearance, whether it's verbal or PDC, has changed. So we can either give them climb and maintain, which doesn't apply to most SIDs because we have to use climb via phraseology, climb via SID, or climb via SID except maintain. The vast majority are getting climb via SID, and the altitude is no longer in there that we were giving them. That was a safety net that they had that is now being revealed. Because since we're giving them climb via SID, we're not giving them altitude, they got to get it off the chart, and we're finding out that they may not have been as diligent as they should have been getting that altitude. So we're getting deviations because they're departing the airport without an altitude. The second thing was needing the runway transition, I think you said. We are aware of that. That is an issue. We have procedures that have multiple runway transitions, so we have to give you an endpoint that gives you the distance and gives you the altitude you need for the FMS to figure out the profile. However, that has always been a terminal requirement. So you get a catch-22. If the terminal is supposed to issue that to you, but you need it prior to top of descent, you're in the center airspace. So a memo came out 2 years ago saying that the centers could issue landing direction, and if by a letter of agreement, the runway transition. And now we're going to make that memo a little bit better by tying it to the descend via clearance now. So if terminal gives it to you, they have to give you a runway transition. If there's multiples, and if the center gives you the descend via clearance, they'll have to at least give you a landing direction. And they could give you a runway transition if they had a letter agreement with the TRACON. So. Vectors off the SID, well, we're required to give you an altitude. So if that isn't done, then we simply have made a mistake. So it is an emphasis item for us to make sure that we give you an altitude. The expect to resume is an if appropriate. So some will take that I don't really need to do that. But as we're finding how complicated these procedures are, how much workload you have with the FMS, and how many things can go wrong, dropping fixes, dropping entire procedures, it would behoove us to tell you to expect to resume and where possibly. Hopefully we can do all that because we are using descend via and we're not manually descending you and turning you and issuing all the speeds, so we'll have time to do that.
So, Mike, from your perspective, do you have anything to add, or would you like to restate anything?
Sure. You had mentioned crew resource management. It's not just for controllers, and it's not just for pilots. It works best when we use it between one another. For instance, if I've got a clearance that I don't understand or I've got a question about, it's incumbent on me as a professional pilot to call clearance delivery and say, I give up. I don't know what this means, so I have a question. Do you really expect me to climb to this altitude? If not, what are you expecting me to do? It takes all the guesswork out of it. The reason we started with crew resource management in the cockpit is because we had a lot of accidents after we investigated them, found out that pilots weren't talking to one another and they weren't quite sure what the other person was doing or what the emphasis should be on at the time. And back when I started my airline career, CRM was just starting. And captains had a hard time with, well, I'm the captain and what I say goes. Well, you know what? You are the captain. I am the captain and what I say goes. But I need my FO's input. I need the controller's input. Sometimes I need the dispatcher's input. I'm not totally familiar with how you guys work in the tower cab or in approach control or in the center, but I do know that when it hits the fan, you're not the only person huddled around the radar scope or looking out the window, okay? That's sort of where we're at, okay? So, yeah, these things are all challenges, and we read about them in ASAP every day, and we can see it, and we can hear about it. But it's incumbent on both of our groups, okay, to be the professionals. You know, if I've got a question, I'm going to ask you. If you've got a question about what we're doing, I expect you to ask me. Because being on the pointy end of the airplane, I sure to hell don't want to hit anybody. And I would reckon that that would ruin your day too. So
I think you made a good point. It isn't just the pilot, it isn't just the controller, it's all about teamwork and making sure we get that across. And especially as we start implementing new procedures like we're talking about right now, it's important to allow for some of that learning to occur and not get frustrated with the questions from either side of the mic. With that, Rick, from a tower perspective, how has this impacted your...
Not very much. Honestly, really for us, it's at the end of the arrival side, no impact whatsoever. On the departure side, at DFW anyway, when there's VFR aircraft in the airspace, we will have to do the climb via accept maintain, which it seems like a lot of words to have to throw out, and we're typically throwing it out as the last thing we do right before we clear you for takeoff, which is not ideal, but sometimes it's just the place that we're in. And I think that what we need to be aware of as controllers is these procedures were designed for computerized airplanes to do computerized things. And as soon as we ask them to get off of this procedure and then get back onto this procedure, the workload that these gentlemen are having to pick up is pretty huge. And if they're flying some of these very light jets and a lot of turboprops and whatnot, these are single air crews trying to do very complicated things. And our part of that, being part of that crew and doing proper CRM, just becomes that much more important. So don't think that we can just throw this stuff out there haphazardly and expect it to go really well, because that's not the way it was designed to work.
Thanks. So tell me from a pilot's perspective, when a controller thinks they're doing you a favor and they give you a shortcut, you're on say you're already on a star, you're established, it's in your FMS, and I'm thinking, hey, I'm going to do this guy a favor, he's going to cut off 50 miles, and I'm going to send him direct to this other fix. What does that do to you?
Well, here's what happens. With regard to that particular example, I'm flying a procedure, you clear me to a specific point. I go ahead, find that point on the legs page in the flight management computer. I bring it to the top of the front page. We verify between both pilots, is this, what are you saying? And they say, yep, and we execute it. And if we're in what we call LNAV, which is the flight mode we're in, lateral flight, the aircraft will go to that point. Great. But what we've done now is we've permanently eliminated all those fixes between our current point and the point we were just cleared to. So now we get handed off to another controller, and he decides, nah, I need them to join over here, a couple of points back. So they say, you're now cleared to this fix, which is 2 fixes back. But we deleted all that. So now what we have to do is we could go in and manually type in each fix and then close up what we call a route discontinuity and make sure we're still back in LNAV. And while we're doing all this, we have to ensure that there may be an altitude and speed restriction at one of those fixes that were deleted. Well, if we manually type that in, we may not get that in there. So we have to go in and actually reselect the whole procedure, which will have that restriction information in it, and then clean it up from there. This takes time. Where are we when this is happening? We're in a critical phase of flight. We're in the descent, and again, it's not a great time for pilots to be necessarily heads down, doing computer programming and verification, and all the while, making sure we're not going to end up with a PD here or make life tough for the controller as far as separation is concerned. So sometimes the favor isn't quite the favor you thought it was. So that can be, from the HF point of view, what we're looking at.
And we could do the same thing with the runway change, too, in the terminal environment, right? The impact is very similar.
Absolutely. It's even more so now. At United, we switched over to our Sabre system. And it requires what we used to do, the old methodology under what we used to call Phoenix, was I would just pick up the phone, so to speak, and call and say, hey, I need numbers for this runway now. So we might pull off to the side and, all right, we're waiting for numbers, get numbers. Well, now the way it works is I have to go in, pull up a particular page, a performance page, type in the new runway, and then enter that and wait for the computer, and my current weight, and wait for the computer to run that data and spit it back to me and tell me, A, if I can use that runway, or if I can't, I may have to go back in and make some adjustments. So I need to do what we call a bleeds off takeoff, which lessens the performance stress on the engines, gives us more available power, and then try it again and see if that works. Well, that still may not work. And then I may have to go in and say, oh, well, we're not going to be able to take that runway. We need a different runway, So this takes time, and it's additional complications. And again, it's another HF factor. Technology is great. We love it. But sometimes it takes one set of problems and replaces it with a whole nother set of problems. And they're not necessarily better ones.
So Dennis, you had something, Rick?
Well, I was just going to say that one of the ones that we get is you'll on initial call, like normal speed to doodah, expect 17 left, and then 5 minutes later, trying to help you out, I can now notice in my evaluation of traffic, I can move you to a runway that's a lot closer to where you're parking. Are you saying it's better to stay with the original plan, even though it may not be as expeditious and fit my need to really stick every airplane in every possible gap that I get?
It's really about time, all right? How much time do we have? Where are we? If it's in the arrival stage and they say, hey, let's give him this other runway. It puts him right by his gate. Yeah, if it's visual, it might work out fine, although I still need to run the numbers and make sure I'm legal for that runway. And that could take a little bit of time. So because it might require different flap setting or different air speeds. There are things that are impacted.
Well, one of the things you brought up when we were preparing for this too was the concept of go down, slow down.
Yeah. Go down, slow down has been a big issue even way before any of this started. Airplanes are, especially the new jets, which are designed in such a way they're very clean, they're very efficient. We have all these great devices hanging off of them, and they're low drag. Well, one of the things they don't do well, believe it or not, is slow down, especially if you're in a descent. So here we are, we went ahead and programmed this whole descent profile. It's predicated on particular speeds that we're flying now and speeds we expected to fly later based on the descent profile. Well, we're right at top of descent or already in the descent. The computer's flying this vertical path that's been pre-calculated, and then the controller, due to whatever reason, it might be separation or any other number of reasons, needs us to slow up. Well, the airplane really can't do it. We might be able to go in and throw our speed brakes in there and help it get a little more aggressive rate of descent. But in a lot of circumstances, it may even exceed the ability to do that. Now, sometimes we can override that, and we can drop out of a certain level of automation to a lower set of automation, and then we have to go ahead and change that bottom altitude, and we have to manually insert each altitude as we go down, because we're going to do this dive and drive thing like we used to with the old approaches. And of course, now what do? We just increased the complexity level, and we opened up a whole nother more options for pilot deviations. So go down, slow down's always been a big problem. If you can refrain from it, great. I understand if you can't. You are controllers, you got to control, you got to separate, but be aware that there are performance problems involved.
All right, so I'd like to go to Dennis and then Mike and kind of wrap up this discussion and then try to go to the audience for some questions.
Okay,
Dennis.
so I just wanted to to say to John, I've never heard a line pilot refuse a shortcut, never. And just because they're like us. Right. Okay, if they can do it, they're going to do it. I spent a lot of time with tech pilots, and they're going to advertise the company line. What's good for the company, what's good for marketing. So yeah, staying on the procedure is a good thing. So it's an education thing on our end. If I really don't need it for separation or sequencing, maybe I should just leave it alone. And then on your end, educate your pilots to say, hey, you know, if you don't need it, you want to stay on the procedure, tell them, you know. Don't always take that shortcut.
And that's on us. I mean, if you take it and we make the problems for ourselves, there are problems. So, yeah, that's something pilots have to be aware of.
Mike.
This is going to sound really sadistic, I think, but I'm going to say it anyway. As an instructor on a highly computerized airplane, you guys provide some of the greatest teaching moments I've ever seen. If you want to make sure that your student understands the automation in the airplane, let them take that shortcut. You know, because they sit there, hey, I just saved 50 miles. Yeah, but you're in the descent, and it was planned on those 50 miles. So you better be hanging something, because we're not going to make that restriction. So you're right. I've never seen a pilot not take the shortcut either. I would encourage them to always take it, but it does increase our workload a little bit. It's always nice if you say, hey, I'm thinking about giving you a shortcut. Does that work for you today? Because if I got 150 knot tailwind, that might not work. And granted, that's a lot more talking between us, but that's not always such a bad thing.
Just want to touch on that shortcut thing really quick. And this is not on descend via. This is rather en route. And one of the things that there's been, you may have not noticed, you may start seeing pilots refusing shortcuts of 1,000 miles or something, you know, on a red eye, you know, clear direct across the country. One of the reasons for that is now the way dispatch and the computer software is calculating is a most efficient route. It may mean that the route that's longer and has more waypoints actually is the faster route, the most efficient route because of the tailwind. Maybe that shortcut puts you right into the teeth of a real big, strong headwind. And you could actually end up in a situation, it has happened once before, anecdotally, where a pilot took a shortcut and ended up short on fuel and had to land short. So shortcuts sometimes mean you're landing short.
No, thanks. That's a good point. So before do we have anybody up at the mic? Because I was hoping people would stand up when I said we're going to go to the audience, but I don't see any yet. There we go, in the middle.
Hi there, Nate Johns, Albuquerque Center Safety Rep. This is more of I guess a discussion point. I didn't realize we were going to go down the descend via path so much, but I observed personally working traffic, also in QC checks, and also validated by our latest external compliance verification that we have a lot of dropped call signs, both on the controller and pilot side. And just toward Jason's original point about positive communication, I just wanted to throw out a suggestion, maybe a program both for NACA, the FAA, ALPA, and also AOPA, EA, all the aviation groups. Maybe a call sign every time type program. I think we've gotten in the mode and used to reading back the meat of the clearance, but we're still in a mode and we still have a few years left before Datacom comes online, even if it does for GA, where we need that positive communication before we even get into all the details of what you gentlemen are discussing. So, anyway,
it's a good point, Nate. I would ask John or Mike, is that part of your SOP that you have to use your call sign?
I know it is at my airline. It's one of the things we look for when we're giving line checks. It's one of the things we teach when we're doing OE. And I know it's one of the things they drill into them in the simulator.
I'll just touch on that real quick. I hit this point last year when I was on this panel, and it really is a back and forth about reinforcing good phraseology. When you guys generally are pretty good at it, sometimes pilots not quite as good, but what'll happen is I notice there's a feedback loop. If we start taking shortcuts, sometimes you guys will pick up on it and vice versa. So if someone starts dropping call signs, we may respond without the call sign as well. And with all those aircraft up there and a lot of similar sounding call signs getting in or out of an airport at the same time, it's a recipe. And more than once, I have seen aircraft pick up clearances for other aircraft because they did not hear the complete call sign.
So that's a big issue. Dennis, you have something to add?
I think the only way to really solve that is for both of us to be operating out of the same handbook, the same phraseology. And it's kind of a pet peeve of mine. I've complained about it a lot to flight standards. And it's kind of a huge logistics issue for how you're going to enforce that with pilots. But right now, I mean, we have the requirements, and we're still sloppy sometimes. We have to do it. They don't. They have the aim that they use, what they learned in ground school, what they hear in the frequency. So they are definitely going to be more lax than us. But that's the only way that we all operate out of the same handbook.
No, that's a good point. We're going to go for a question over here. Next.
Yeah, Peter Sachs from SFO. Now that we're doing simultaneous RNAV departures, we're supposed to say RNAV to the first fix, which is a lot of extra talking when it's one local controller. And a lot of the pilots aren't familiar hearing that, so they're coming back and questioning it when there's a very small departure hole. So I'm wondering what the purpose of that phraseology is when it just seems to be increasing workload and confusion.
Mike.
Flying in and out of Atlanta every day, I can tell you, if your clearance gets changed or your runway gets changed, and you could be on the same clearance, but because you've switched runways, you may be going to a different fix. So if you don't have it loaded in the box correctly, and all of a sudden the controller says, cleared for take, or cleared to such and such a RNAV to such and such a fix, cleared for takeoff, that fix better click in your head because that's where he thinks you're going. If it's different in the box, you better call timeout and get it fixed. And that's why it's important at places like San Francisco, because those runways are really close, and you don't want the guy on the right side taking the turn into the left.
So that's actually a problem we don't have, because whether you take one left or one right, if you're on the truck and it's the same first fix. Likewise for the left turns. It sounds like maybe this is something that can be modified depending on the facility and the design of the procedure.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. I was just going to say.
You're correct. It was a fail-safe because there was a couple really nasty incidents. So we had to come up with something. So it is something that probably needs to be looked at. And also, there's times where you have both runways. You're not departing off both runways. It doesn't make sense if you don't have anybody on the other runway. Why would you have to do that? But that's a question that somebody brought up. So we're looking into that kind of stuff to see what we can tweak.
And I think the problem even originated at DFW, where the parallels are operated by different controllers over 2 miles apart, that you don't have any awareness of what's going on the other side. So it was just a protecting everybody from everybody else sort of thing. And we also do have to paint with just one brush because we are the FAA and that's the way we do it. But the last part really is, for the pilot standpoint, if you do it one way in San Francisco and I do it a different way in DFW, and then Dennis and the guys do it different in Philadelphia, and Atlanta's doing it another way, it's really hard on the air crews then. That's why we're lining up and waiting now instead of going into taxi into position and hold, because we're having translation issues as we now are this entire global economy of aviation. So I think it may not feel great to San Francisco. It didn't really feel good to us when we did it. You just may be a victim of our unsuccesses early on.
No, thanks. Did you have anything to add, Mike, or did Rick cover it? All right, we'll go to a question here in the middle. We'll do one more question over there on the left, and then I think we're going to be close to out of time.
My facility has descend via stars, and I'm routinely asked to alleviate the speed restrictions. How much work do you have to do in the cockpit to meet those altitudes, meet all those fixes, and then just remove only the speed?
Well, actually, deleting speed restrictions is really easy. We just go in there and delete, and it's done, because it hasn't changed the lateral path. And what it may do is modify the vertical path, because the aircraft knows now it doesn't have to slow up more. So it may have a flatter trajectory coming down because it can fly at an increased speed. So deleting speeds generally is never going to be an issue. It's a pretty simple fix. It's when we slow the air, we want a slower speed Something more restrictive is where it gets difficult for the aircraft to comply, and for the pilots now during a critical phase of flight to make those changes, verify those changes, and ensure compliance, all during that same period of time.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Question over there on the left?
Yeah, for our areas and procedures here, we already heard about basically controllers are issuing computerized instructions. Do you think that there's a point where we actually are going beyond where we need to be right now and should pull it back? We don't need all the gee whiz, 20 approaches into one airport, 20 procedures out, where we can actually make it simplified until the technology catches up?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'm on a team. It's called PERT, which is Procedure, Review, Revise, Remove. And it's an effort to try and identify a lot of those procedures that aren't being used and to try and get rid of them. And this is all part of the FAA's plan to put procedures in, just like you said, where you need them, when you need them, instead of just trying to build all this infrastructure. And it's all about quantity and not quality. So, yeah, you're dead on.
Thanks. Mike?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you think about it, you're reading me something that's generated off a computer. I'm inserting it into a computer. And I'm relying on that computer to do exactly what your computer told the two of us you wanted me to do. So it's sort of incumbent on the two of us to make sure that what you're giving me is exactly what you're expecting, and what I'm putting in the box is exactly what you're expecting. And we do have some checks there. You know, I've got the other pilot, and it's his job to make sure that I've loaded that thing correctly. So, but that whole computer-to-computer thing, I hope they never get rid of the human interface, because I've seen the infinite loop and it's ugly.
Thanks. Before we end, I would like to end on just one question, going back a little bit to the standardization, the question from San Francisco, and I think Mike and John kind of hit on it a little bit about making sure we have standardization across, and how important or unimportant is it to standardize those procedures so that people at San Francisco are learning the same thing as the people at Dallas, as Atlanta, at Charlotte, at all the facilities around the country. How important or unimportant is that? And that's for Dave and Jason, from a human factors perspective.
Well, in my opinion, the standardizing procedures nationwide makes it far easier for the pilots to anticipate. I had a conversation with a SWAPA pilot a couple of weeks ago, and he was expressing some frustration about the different ways in which facilities do descend via, because everybody does it different. The phraseology is different, a little bit different in every facility. The procedure is a little different in every facility, and everybody's got their idiosyncrasies, for lack of a better term. So I think if we can get to a point nationwide where we can standardize procedures, keep procedures fundamentally the same, figure in SOP and LOA restrictions, of course, so I think it would be far easier for the pilots to interact with us.
Thanks. Jason, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's a workload reduction issue, and it's something that Mike said earlier I wanted to close on, which was around challenging when people don't understand the clearance they've heard, because I suspect many times people don't question what they think they don't understand and just hope it works out, because no one wants to appear to be the one that didn't understand. So I think the standardization takes that away.
Oh, thanks. So please, that's the end of the panel. Thanks a lot for your participation from the audience, and let's thank the panel members. And you can go ahead and leave. I'm going to go ahead and move over here because I left something over here, and we're going to move on to the next thing. Thank you, guys.